İyi akşamlar, hoş geldiniz. My name is Buket Coşkuner. I am the manager of Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, ANAMED. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second talk of Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talk Series. Before leaving the floor, today's moderator Akif Ercihan Yerlioğlu and speaker Konrad Hirschler, let me say a few words about the occasion. Yavuz Sezer Lecture Series is a joint effort of Yavuz friends here in Turkey and abroad, in memoriam of Yavuz, whom we lost to COVID in March 2021. This series is part of a larger initiative aims to commemorate the intellectual legacy of our late friend and colleague Yavuz Sezer. Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks, co-organized by the Istanbul Research Institute, Koç University Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, Boğaziçi University Department of History, and Yavuz Friends, to carry forward his multidimensional approach to urban history, which brought together spaces, people, and ideas. Each year, we host a historian whose work makes an important contribution to the history of architecture, urban studies, or book culture. Last year, the inaugural lecture was given online by Roger Chartier. And this evening, we are hosting Konrad Hirschler with his lecture on Bibliophilia, one of Yavuz's favorite subjects. And our aim is to facilitate conversations across these fields that will realize Dr. Sezer's vision of a multifaceted cultural history that brought together the material and the intellectual. And it happens only with the contributions of Yavuz friends, colleagues, and professors. To name some of them: Aslıhan Gürbüzel, Murat Şiviloğlu, Deniz Türker, Sema Horuz, Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz, Mehmet Kentel, Akif Yerlioğlu, Ahmet Ersoy, Çiğdem Kafesçioğlu. I would like to thank organizers of today's event for their joint efforts in pulling it together. And this evening, Yavuz sisters, Nurdan Sezer is with us. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to invite first Nurdan Hanım to share a few words with us. Buraya buyurunuz.
Herkese merhaba. Akif Bey ile konuştuğumda birkaç kelam eder misin dediğinde inşallah ağlamadan yaparım dedim. Fakat fotoğrafla karşılaşınca yine duygulandım. Bizim 11 yıl önce çekildiğimiz bir fotoğraf ben çekmiştim. İşte malum Ortaköy'de. Çok güzel bir gündü. Annem, Yavuz abim ve ben birlikteydik. Abimin konularıyla alakalı şeylerin konuşulduğu bir ortamda onun olmamasını idrak etmekte zorlanıyorum. Yani çünkü hepiniz biliyorsunuz, yani tanıyanlar, şahsen tanıyanlar iyi biliyor ki konuşmayı ve anlatmayı çok seven biri idi Yavuz abim. O yüzden onun ilgi alanı olan konulardan birileri bahsederken, konuşurken, bir şeyler söylerken onun da konuşmuyor olması, konuşuyor olmaması çok enteresan geliyor bana. Bunu kabul etmekte hala çok zorlanıyorum. 2 yıla yakın bir zaman oldu maalesef ki o illet hastalık sebebiyle çok hızlı bir şekilde hem abimi hem de annemi kaybettim. Aşırı derecede özlediğimi söylememe herhalde gerek yok. Ama bizim için, hem benim hem de bütün ailemiz için çok büyük bir gurur kaynağı. Sizlerin, dostlarının, meslektaşlarının, öğrencilerinin, arkadaşlarının Yavuz'u anmaya devam etmesi, yani onun için bir şeyler yapma gayreti içinde olması ve saygı ve sevgisinin bitmemesi bizim için gerçekten çok büyük bir gurur kaynağı ve teselli, çok büyük bir teselli. Onun için hepinize çok çok çok teşekkür ediyorum. Gözyaşlarım için lütfen kusura bakmayın. Çok teşekkürler.
Biz teşekkür ederiz. Geldiğiniz için de çok teşekkür ederiz. Akif Ercihan Yerlioğlu, who is the moderator of the talk, is an assistant professor at the Department of History, Boğaziçi University. He completed his PhD at Harvard University's joint program in Middle Eastern Studies and History. His research was supported by many prestigious grants. I will cut it short, but I want to mention, I'm glad to tell that Akif was an al-Nadim Fellow in 2017. And later on, Akif was al-Named's team's, my Ottoman instructor for a short while. Now I invite Akif to take over the program for his introduction. Are you going to continue there? Or? Okay.
Thank you, Buket. Greetings, everyone. Today we are here for the second of the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks. There will be some repetitions like thanking, acknowledging some people. I would like to start by acknowledging the organizations and people that made this series possible. Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, al-Nadim, Istanbul Research Institute, the Department of History at Boğaziçi University, Yavuz Friends, and of course to Professor Konrad Hirschler, who has graciously agreed to give a talk today. And last year, as Buket said, Professor Roger Chartier gave the inaugural lecture of this series, unfortunately online, due to the ongoing pandemic measures. But we are very glad to be able to have Professor Hirschler in person in Istanbul, and we will be able to commemorate Yavuz all together. Please allow me to briefly talk about our dear friend Yavuz and then give the floor to Professor Hirschler. Yavuz Sezer was born in Istanbul on the 13th of September 1979. He lived in the Koca Mustafa Pasha neighborhood, close to the Hekimoğlu Ali Pasha Library, a beautiful 18th century library, which would later become one of the protagonists in his doctoral work. Yavuz went to Vefa High School, surrounded by other 18th century Ottoman architectural structures such as the Şehit Ali Pasha Library or the Recai Mehmed Efendi Sibyan Mektebi Children's School. In the acknowledgement section of his doctoral dissertation, Yavuz notes, I quote, "I remember brightly the evening, probably in 1988, when my father, Muammer Sezer, whom we lost in 2005, first brought home my beloved children's encyclopedia, which prepared much of the foundation for my curiosity about architectural history," end of quote. Probably Yavuz's friends would know this story, this memory well. Probably during his high school years, excuse me, at Vefa, he had already begun to raise some essential questions regarding the architectural heritage of his surroundings, the answers to which he would find during his later studies. Yavuz completed his BA and MA at Boğaziçi University's History Department, where he also taught the course Making of the Modern World, and I was lucky enough to get to know him as a student in the course and was immediately impressed by his depth of knowledge as well as his passion to teach. In 2008, Yavuz started his PhD, at the MIT's History, Theory, and Criticism program on the history of architecture, and completed his doctoral dissertation entitled The Architecture of Bibliophilia, 18th Century Ottoman Libraries, in 2016. His work demonstrates how 18th century Ottoman libraries both reflected and shaped the aesthetic, intellectual, and cultural quests of the Ottoman reading public. Some of Yavuz's friends had taken the initiative to turn this dissertation into a book and make it accessible to more readers, and I hope that it will come out soon and his meticulous work will be appreciated by more people. Yavuz taught at Bilgi University in the Department of Architecture from 2013 to 2021 last year. Unfortunately, on the 24th of March last year, we lost Yavuz due to complications of COVID-19. Here, I'm not going to list some of his great ideas and inspiring unfinished projects, which are plenty. Rather, I would like to share a personal anecdote to indicate one path through which his legacy continues, I guess. Until a few months ago, I was meeting regularly with a graduate student at Boğaziçi in our department as part of his preparation for the doctoral qualifying exam to discuss some of the academic works, including those on the reading culture and the history of the books. A few days before our particular meeting, I realized that I had checked out the only available library copies of the books we were supposed to discuss for that week. And I was wondering whether the student could find all the sources he needed from somewhere else. During the meeting, I was surprised to see that the student was holding the very same books with Boğaziçi library labels on them. I asked to learn whether there were new arrivals to the library, and my student said, "Hocam, these are apparently once Yavuz Hoca's books. They have just been donated and added to the library collection. That's why they don't appear on the system yet." With a sad smile on my face, we began our discussion in remembrance of Yavuz about the subjects that he dedicated his life to, such as manuscripts, their owners, libraries, readers, so on and so forth. Yavuz considered Boğaziçi University his home, and now hundreds of his books, which were donated by his family so kindly after his passing, are still there. As the anecdote I have just shared indicates, they were put to immediate use thanks to the efforts of the library staff who also knew him and loved him. As many of the Ottoman authors would note in the introductory sections of their books, some readers who borrowed the books, Yavuz's books, once owned by him, have already begun paying tribute to him and honoring his soul. In Turkish, okuyanlar hayırla ya da hayır duasıyla yad etsin, ruhu şad olsun. Thanks to his several friends, a graduate grant, Yavuz Sezer Scholarship in Architectural and Urban History, was established at Boğaziçi University at his home to continue his legacy through a new generation of scholars interested in similar areas of research. I also want to share some recent news about an article prize named after Yavuz and its first recipient. Within last year, the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies had invited scholars to apply for the Yavuz Sezer Article Prize in the History of Architecture and the Urban Environment. Just today, a few hours ago, I learned that Namık Erkal's article entitled Reserved Abundance, State Granaries of Early Modern Istanbul was awarded with the prize for the first time. Beyond these many opportunities to commemorate Yavuz, I think for his friends there are many other humble things that will remind us of him. Especially if you live in Istanbul, if you pass by its historic parts, if you spend some time in libraries, if you contemplate the book you are holding in your hand as an artifact and as an intellectual product, its production process, and its previous owners. Today we will turn to a library, not in the Sublime Port, but once still within the Ottoman realm, the al-Jazzar Library of Acre, or Acre, a repository of quite significant manuscripts. Shortly, we will hear more about it, but let me first introduce Professor Hirschler, who actually needs no introduction for those working on the medieval Islamic world and its book culture and its many archives. Konrad Hirschler is professor of Middle Eastern history at Universität Hamburg Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures. He previously taught at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and Freie Universität Berlin. His areas of interest include, but not limited to, the history of reading, the book, and libraries, with an emphasis on material culture. He's the author of many books and articles. I will only include some of them, but some award-winning books such as A Monument to Medieval Syrian Book Culture in 2019, Medieval Damascus Plurality and Diversity in an Arabic Library 2016, The Written Word in the Medieval Arabic Lens and Medieval Arabic Historiography 2012. He's also the co-author of Owning Books and Preserving Documents in Medieval Jerusalem and Mu'allafat Yusuf bin Hassan ibn Abdallah Hadi, as well as co-editor of the Damascus Fragments and manuscript notes as documentary sources. In his work on manuscripts, Professor Hirschler pays close attention to various processes and individuals that led the way to the final product, the manuscript itself. For instance, his insight on how some standalone pieces of writing or booklets were transformed into compilations or majmu'as, or how majmuization, as he terms in his writing, happened is quite enlightening for the students of Islamic manuscripts, because as one of his chapter titles clearly put forward, binding matters. Manuscript notes too. By using certificates of audition or reading certificates, sama'at, in manuscripts, which indicated who attended the reading of a particular book or book section, Professor Hirschler sheds light on the readers or listeners, those individuals who cannot be easily traced in other sources, such as biographical dictionaries. Apart from what is recorded in a book at the hands of its author, copyist, or owner, the afterlife of a particular piece of writing, a fragment from a book for reuse could also be quite significant, as Professor Hirschler's work shows us. So in a way, unbinding or fragmentation also matter in manuscript cultures. That's why he proposes that, quote, we reuse fragments in the same way as building spolia, end of quote. I cannot go into the details of his many influential ideas and the importance of his research in the larger scholarship. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Hirschler. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind and very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to hold the second lecture in memory of Yavuz Sezer. I met Yavuz once at a conference here in Istanbul in 2018 over at the German Orient Institute, and after the presentation we had a short chat, and it was clear right away that he was a highly knowledgeable and very pleasant colleague with whom I enormously enjoyed chatting. His PhD thesis, The Architecture of Bibliophilia, is a major contribution to the field of Ottoman studies and also for myself as a historian of libraries. And we had all been aware that in the course of the 17th century, independent library buildings started to appear in Istanbul, but Yavuz was the first one who really wrote the history of this process and who conceptualized it, who really understood the meaning of it and brought it out. And in his thesis, he wonderfully showed how the spread of these purpose-built libraries across the topography of Istanbul was a major transformation of this topography, and that it was accompanied also by a material change in the book culture of Istanbul during that period. Namely, that this period witnessed a significant rise of the majmu'a, i.e. of the manuscript, which brought together different texts from various fields such as theology, adab, literature, poetry, medicine, and so on. So as much as the library buildings changed the topography of the city, these books changed the materiality of book culture at the same time. And the audiences of these books, these majmu'as, were the jalabis, the gentlemen, so to say, who developed new reading tastes. And Yavuz brought in space and materiality to understand this development. I think that's really the important part, because he succeeded in triangulating urban history, the spatiality of the city, the history of the book, and intellectual/social history. And this triangulation, I think, is really the interesting part of his work. And my last book, A Monument to Medieval Syrian Book Culture, I repeatedly cite Yavuz, and my thinking about these majmu'as were quite influenced by his PhD thesis, which I read during the process of doing my research. And it is thus with deepest respect towards his scholarship that I deliver this lecture to honor his memory. My lecture tonight refers to the title of Yavuz's thesis, The Architecture of Bibliophilia, 18th Century Ottoman Libraries. But tonight we will move outside Istanbul, namely we will move towards Acre, towards the Arabic-speaking provinces of the Ottoman Empire on the Palestinian coast, as you see here on the map. Acre became, in the late 18th century, a major urban center in southern Bilad al-Sham, i.e. modern-day Jordan, Israel, Palestine, plus southern Lebanon, southern Syria. It turned to be one of the main cities in the regions. Previously, it really had been a backwater. It had been a village, which in the 15th, 16th, 17th century played no role whatsoever. The 18th century urban growth is deeply written into the topography of Acre. Anybody who walks through the city, who walks through the streets, can basically see the buildings erected during this period of rapid development and expansion. And in particular, anybody walking through Acre will see this building, which is until today the central focus point of the topography in terms of how the streets are laid out and the visuality of the city, the mosque of al-Jazzar. And in this mosque was a splendid library, basically on this corner, arguably the richest Muslim library that ever existed in Palestine over the last millennium. And it is the history of this library we will be looking at tonight as a case study of what Ottoman bibliophilia meant outside Istanbul. Before starting with the actual history, I have to underline that what I will be presenting today is a group work, i.e. we are a group of some 20 colleagues who have come together in order to study that library from different universities in the world, including also colleagues from Turkey, and Nimet İpek is here tonight. She's also one of the team members. The aim of this project is to write a collaborative history of the library and also to contribute to the conservation efforts of the books that are still in the library today. We are doing this in collaboration with the Endowment Board of Trustees in Acre, especially Dr. Hussam Tarfish, whose support for our project has to be very emphatically mentioned and is absolutely crucial for our work. But this conservation, preservation project is not what I will be speaking about tonight. This is a different strand of what we are doing. So who is this al-Jazzar? After whom the mosque and also the library was named. Al-Jazzar was a decisive figure in southern Bilad al-Sham in the late 18th century, and he was also a very divisive figure, highly contested until today. We will come to the contested part of his legacy in a minute. The term governor is somewhat misleading, as he de facto enjoyed a very high degree of autonomy. He chose Acre to be the geographical center of the political project which he adopted, and as his capital, one might even say, as he de facto created something like an independent polity during his reign. So even though he was formerly an Ottoman governor, it's very difficult to put him into a very tight Ottoman political structure. His powerful political position of independence was not so much the outcome of Ottoman decline, i.e. it was not the weakening of the center which allowed him to be so independent, but it was rather that al-Jazzar understood the economic transformation which was taking place in Europe during the 18th century, and in particular he understood the European demand for cotton and for grain, for the new industry which were developing in southern France, especially in Marseille and in Manchester also, and the population growth in Europe which demanded an enormous import of goods. So he converted Palestinian agriculture into an export-orientated cash crop agriculture, which in turn generated enormous tax income for his own polity and allowed him to develop this large degree of political independence. So in many senses, he was a political entrepreneur. He was not only a statesman, but he was also economically very astute and was able to convert this position into an independent polity, principality, state, one might even say. He was strong enough to defeat Napoleon. So al-Jazzar was the one who stopped Napoleon in the Middle East. When Napoleon marched over from Egypt into Bilad al-Sham, he was defeated at Acre and had to return, and that was the end of the first French colonial project in the Middle East. Obviously, he did not do this out of nothing. He's not a lone star in the dark sky, but this is a long process which we see in the 18th century, where southern Bilad al-Sham is increasingly being transformed, and one of his predecessors, Ahmad Pasha, already had set up a quasi-independent polity in the region. Al-Jazzar is very negatively depicted in European reports of the period and in later Arabic chronicles. But the important part is in later Arabic chronicles. We don't really have any chronicles contemporaneous to al-Jazzar being written in his environment. So what we have are very much later reflections on his rule. And they are basically very negative. The Europeans are not very surprising that they don't like al-Jazzar. Al-Jazzar put an end to the Napoleonic expansion, and he was the one who imposed himself as a middleman between the European traders and the Palestinian peasants. Obviously, the European traders always try to get direct access to Palestinian peasants, which al-Jazzar prevented, and he quite successfully imposed himself as a middleman. And so for the European, he was corrupt, he was barbaric, he was a tyrant, he was despotic. He was basically the incarnation of Oriental despotism. If you want to know where the idea of Oriental despotism comes from, it's generated to some extent around the figure of al-Jazzar, interestingly so. In the Arabic chronicles, they often picked up these negative depictions in the later 19th and 20th century, and he was then often depicted as the typical example of the despotic, tyrant, Ottoman political figure, which has nothing to do with Arabs here living in the regions today. One final point which has to be mentioned is that the adjective Ottoman is, let's say, not straightforward in his case, or at least demands some qualification. He was of Albanian origin, and in many ways his career fits a typical profile of an elite Ottoman figure. And that the Ottoman world was an important part of the framework of reference in which he was acting is evident by the mosque itself. Because at that point it was not called al-Jazzār mosque as we call it today and as the mosque itself calls itself today, but it was called Nur Ahmadiyya. And as my colleague Guy Burak has convincingly argued, this is very much a reference to Nur al-Osmaniyya, which was built some decades earlier here in Istanbul. So this naming pattern is very clearly a very strong reference to an Ottoman worldview in which he was acting. Yet al-Jazzar had also spent many years in Egypt as part of the Egyptian Neo-Mamluk elite. And this Neo-Mamluk Egyptian world was clearly also an important frame of reference for him. For instance, he calls himself always a Mamluk. That was his identity. He was a Mamluk, and his men were also Mamluks. And the whole system which they built up was very much framed into a political idiom of Mamluk political culture. And interestingly so, in his library we find one endowment deed. This is not the endowment deed of his library, but the endowment deed of the Mamluk Sultan Bars Bey of the 15th century in Cairo. And the fact that he had this endowment deed in his library, in fact it was a copy, it was not the original, it's a complicated story, but let's keep it, he has a copy in his library, clearly signified that he was also looking at the Mamluk mausoleum of al-Baybars as an example for his own mosque. And his own mosque is really positioned between these two poles, between the Istanbul Nur al-Osmaniyya and the Cairo mausoleum of al-Bars Bey. Okay, scholarship has dealt with al-Jazzar. So what I've told about the development of al-Jazzar, this is not new, this is not our research, and the book by Thomas Phillip is one of the examples where he has really shown the development of this figure. He shows him as a ruthless ruler. Clearly al-Jazzar was not a very pleasant figure. You can imagine converting Palestinian agriculture into a cash crop agriculture is not a very discursive process which we are undertaking, but includes a very brutal way of forcing peasants to change the way of economic activities. But Phillips also shows him as successfully building up a highly efficient state and safeguarding a high degree of autonomy vis-à-vis the Ottoman center and able to fight off the troops of Napoleon. Scholarship has also acknowledged his massive urban building projects in Acre, which is not too difficult. I mean, if you go to Acre, you see al-Jazzar all over the place, such as the large-scale endowment complex, which we see here also on the title page of Philip's book. This endowment complex consisted of the normal features which you always see. It's obviously a mosque, but there's also a madrasa, there's a water fountain, mausoleum, and a whole range of other amnesties, such as the sundial, which you see here built by the scholar Ibrahim al-Fardi al-Kurdi, and also the library, which you see here now in the complex itself, with the characteristic Ottoman quote from the Quran, Fiha Kutub Kayma, which you see in many Ottoman library buildings. Yet the role of al-Jazzar as a cultural patron has not really been researched so far. And for example, in the book of Philip, the library is not mentioned once. And this is where we come in with our al-Jazzar library project, that we basically want to bring in the library as one part of the way of how he ruled the city, how he displayed himself to a wider audience, to think about what bibliophilia, to use Yavuz's term, meant in this specific context. And this project is so important, in our view at least, and I hope also I can convince you that it is important, because this library has basically become invisible. It's not there anymore. If you go today to the mosque in Acre, you will not find a single book in this room anymore. There's another room where you will find 25 manuscripts of the original library. out of 1,800. So in 1800 there were 1,800 books, today they are 25, and the memory of this splendid library was thus in some sense lost, and thus also the function that this library played. The second aim with our project is that the study of book culture has been very much focused on the cities, Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus so far. And by studying the Jazzār library, we hope to put the province on the map and to think about what the province contributes to the developments which we are looking at, and to show the richness of book culture, of literary culture, of libraries far from Istanbul, Damascus, and Cairo. Putting this library and Acre on the cultural map is also so important because this library contained extremely valuable books, and this is the most famous examples, which is the Fihrist of al-Nadim, a very famous book which hardly needs introduction, written in the 10th century, which lists all the book titles known to al-Nadim, who was a book trader in Baghdad, very handy. So through his shop all the books passed, and he wrote this massive book which gives us a unique insight into the circulation of books in the early Islamic period. And this is not only a manuscript, but this is the oldest manuscript which exists in the world. This is copied from a copy which Ibn Nadim wrote, so second generation, that's as early as we get. And any edition today of the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim uses this manuscript. And it's not very surprising that we see on the title page very prominent owners. For example, in the 15th century, the historian al-Maqrizi, a very important historian of Cairo, owned this manuscript because he was clearly aware of what he's holding in his hands. And then it went into the library of al-Jazzar, and here you see the stamp of the library of al-Jazzar, which you will see reappearing throughout the lecture. And here, these lines, this is the endowment statement of al-Jazzar's library, which you will also see on manuscripts throughout the lecture. This is only one example of the splendid books that were held in Acre during that period, i.e. this is not a run-of-the-mill library, but this was clearly a library which attracted some of the most important books which were circulating in the Middle East during that period. Today, the manuscript is in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, and this fact that it is in Dublin brings us to the third aim of our project, which is provenance research, i.e. that we try to track down where are these 1,075 manuscripts, which are not in Acre anymore, where are they today, and how did they get to where they are today. The library, as I said, had been completely dismantled. Just 1% of the manuscripts are still in Acre. The rest is somewhere else, such as the Chester Beatty Library we have just seen. And the patron of this library is Chester Beatty, who is a mining tycoon of the early 20th century. He built up an enormous manuscript collection, not only Islamic manuscripts, but also other manuscripts. And the Arabic Islamic manuscripts he bought from one trader called Abraham Yehuda, who was one of the most influential traders of Middle Eastern manuscripts and cultural objects in the first half of the 20th century. And we will return to him later on as he plays an important part in the provenance story of the library. But let me just say some words why we have the project right now. Scholarship had been aware of the existence of the library, so you find references here and there, yet what exactly this library was, how many books were there, what books were in this library remained entirely unknown. We just had some vague idea that there was something like a library. And the reason that we couldn't really pin it down was we just didn't have the sources, quite banal. The sigillat of Acre from that period are lost. They are gone. We don't know where they are. It's a problem for us. It has been a problem for the last 40 years that we can't really understand the history of Acre through documentary evidence. So what we had so far were some manuscripts in the world where we had the stamp of al-Jazzar, and Boris Librens, who is also part of our project. Boris Librens here tracked them down, but that's all what we knew. But this situation changed completely 2 years ago when Nada Mumtaz from Toronto University shared with us this discovery from the Vakıflar Genel Müdürlüğü in Ankara. And this is a copy of the library catalogue. And this was, so to say, our Rosetta Stone. Finally, we could make sense out of what were only references so far. The original was written in 1800, before al-Jazzar died. This one was written in 1806, after al-Jazzar died, i.e. this is not the original manuscript catalogue, so to say, but this is an inventory, which was most likely written for the purpose of confiscating al-Jazzar's property. That's at least our theory so far. We don't know yet really how this played out, but we believe that this was written in the framework of the Ottoman Center trying to understand what is there in Acre. And this Defter 1626 contains also other documents relevant for the al-Jazzar endowment in Acre. The first part prior to this inventory is the endowment deed itself. Then you have the inventory of the library, and then you have a list of expenditure and income of the Waqf, where you basically get a sense of what the properties were. So I would call this a multiple document manuscript, which was put together for that purpose. Okay, anybody who has ever seen an Ottoman period library list or inventory feels very much at home when looking at this register. This is not very surprising, i.e. here we are right in the depth of Ottoman documentary culture and documentary logic. Each entry is given with a short title. Here we are again at the Fihrist of al-Nadim. In this case, we know what the book is. Those of you who have worked with book lists know in 75% of the cases we don't know what the title refers to because it's so short that we can't really crack it, but that's a different problem. What is quite nice in this inventory is that also the khat, the script, is mentioned. Here it's called al-Khat al-Misri, and there is a whole range of categories. We haven't really understood yet what they understood under al-Khat al-Misri, because I mean, this is from Baghdad in the 11th century, and why is this called al-Khat al-Misri? This is the problem which Niemet has to crack. This is her responsibility, so I won't talk about it. What we also have, which is really beautiful, is the size of the manuscript. So this librarian had a very clear idea of book sizes, and he had a clear category of full, half, quarter, eighth, basically quarter, folio, and so on. Here you see muhayyar an-nisf. Muhayyar for the cataloger means roughly. You know, it's not really nisf, it's not really a half size, but it's almost a half size. And then we have the binding. It's bound or not bound. In this case, it is bound. And then it's given bila darf, without slipcase. And this is really beautiful because that's what you find quite rarely, so that you have information on the slipcases of books, which was a very important feature of pre-modern book culture. But most of these slipcases have been lost today, and there has not been a comprehensive study of slipcases. So this at least gives us an insight into, basically, this is not a slipcase from al-Jazzar. This is a stock photo which I took from some other publication. So we haven't found a single al-Jazzar slipcase so far. But at least from the inventory, we know that 1,500 books had slipcases, which is a very impressive number, as most of them were bound. And Karin Chepper from Leiden University, she's working on that. She will write a chapter on the bindings and the slipcases. And finally, the inventory always gives the number of volumes of that specific book, which in this case is 1 volume, because the Fihrist is only in 1 volume. So the inventory gives us an insight into the books held in such a library in the Ottoman province during that period. Here I adopted the thematic classification of the inventory itself. It's not our interpretation of the titles, but it's the interpretation of the year 1800 of what is in this library. Not very surprising in many cases, so you have the transmitted sciences, Quran, Tasif, recitation, Hadith, Fiqh, Tawheed, Tasawwuf, quite prominently represented. You have the philological sciences, grammar, Ma'ani, Bayan, Adab, Ilm al-Lugha, Ilm al-Sarf, and poetry, which again you would expect in such a library. Dream interpretation, history, very important for him. Then you have medicine, logic, and then basically the book on mathematics, on engineering, chemistry, chemia, and so on. And then you have some remaining categories, Persian and Turkish books, which is misleading because there are also Ottoman books in the upper categories. We don't know why some books were put apart. And then you have two sections which are really interesting, which say 203 books, and they are listed, these 203 books, taken from Yahya Effendi Atibi, Jaffa. We don't know yet who this Yahya Effendi is, but we do know that al-Jazzar took books from him. In the inventory it says taken from. And this is obviously a whole range of interpretation. What taken from means, most likely al-Jazzar appropriated them in a rather ruthless and not very pleasant way for poor Yahya Effendi and also for Ali al-Rashidi, who lost 75 books to al-Jazzar's library. The challenge to anybody who has ever worked on pre-modern classification of knowledge is that the books which we find in the categories do not really match our own expectations of these classifications. For example, Hadith 231 has a lot of books which for us today are not Hadith anymore. But for the writer of this catalog, he clearly had a very different conceptualization of what Hadith meant. For him, anything related to the Prophet Muhammad is Hadith. Sirah, Manaqib, whatever it is Hadith. Whereas today we obviously limit it rather to the reports of the saying and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. The same goes for other sections. For example, in history, you have the work Yatimat ad-Dahar by Tha'alabi, and this is poetry. I mean, this is just poetry for us. I mean, we would never put it into history. There's no link which we could draw between our idea of history and this book. But for the writer of this inventory, this was clearly a historical books. In other words, the colleagues who are writing on these sections, their main challenge is that they have to grasp the conceptual world of the writer of this inventory, which is often quite alien to our conceptual framework. Apart from the methodological challenge, a principal question that increasingly emerging is the question, what purpose did this library actually have? Why did al-Jazzar build this library? I mean, it's very unlikely that he ever looked at these books. I mean, from all descriptions which we have, it's unlikely that he spent his days reading books in the library. In the endowment seal on the library, it says it's for the madrasa. In the mosque, which would be quite straightforward. And the madrasa function is also supported by some thematic sections, which we earlier saw. For example, the grammar section is more or less what you would expect in a madrasa context. So that does fit. But there's one problem. Namely, no chronicle mentions a madrasa in Acre during that period. As said, there are not many contemporaneous chronicles, so this should not be held too much against it. But we also do not have a single scholar who ever said that he taught in Acre, or that he studied in Acre. i.e. Acre played zero role in the educational landscape of Bilad al-Sham during that period. So is it really a madrasa library when there is no trace whatsoever of any educational activity in the city? The endowment deed mentions a single teacher for the madrasa, which is not impressive. The expenditure list does never mention a salary for the madrasa teacher. You know, so it seems to be a theoretical concept. You know, we need a madrasa teacher, but then when it comes to the payout, seemingly poor teacher never got anything, or he never existed. So far, the question we are dealing with the library is whether it can better be described as a court library, a library that served rather representational purposes. You know, al-Jazzar looking to Nur Osmaniye, looking to Cairo, seeing these libraries and having the impression as if I want to be a decent ruler, I need such a big library. And al-Jazzar clearly built his complex as a display of power and status. And the presence of valuable manuscripts, such as the al-Fihrist, certainly supports the impression that the display of status and wealth may have played a major role when building up the library collection for al-Jazzar. And the representational function of the library is also supported by the analysis of some of the sections of the library. Our colleague Dana Sajdi from Toronto is working on the history section. And what she shows is that the profile of the history books does not really match what we would expect to be in a madrasa, but rather matches what one would expect to find at the court of a ruler who wants to present a certain image of himself. We have another problem. When looking at the thematic profile, al-Jazzar probably did not build up the library catalogue in a purposeful way at all moments. Certainly he bought some books on purpose and said, I want to have these books. But as we have seen, many books were taken by confiscation. You know, that he confiscated the library of others. And we assume that these libraries were included in full. So the libraries, the books in his library is not necessarily his choice. You know, that I want these 10 books, but it might be that Yahya Effendi had bought these books, and because al-Jazzar confiscated his collection, they ended up in his library. So it's always dangerous to ascribe too much meaning and purpose to the books which we find on the shelves of such a library. So there's certainly no conclusive answer to what exactly the library was, and it's really probably a mixture between madrasa, court, and probably also other functions. Good, now I'm coming to the last part of my lecture, and this is provenance, i.e. where did all these manuscripts go which are not in Acre anymore? Some 99% of the manuscripts have disappeared, and so to think about provenance and to think with provenance is also meant to take a proactive stance on an issue that will come on our field very soon, i.e. the questions how the manuscripts as physical objects were taken out of the al-Jazzar library and made their way into collections worldwide. And this obviously raises a whole range of ethical issues about the presence of these manuscripts in different libraries, including collections in the US and Europe, Princeton, London, Dublin, Berlin, Leipzig. Yet the number of manuscripts that went to libraries in the US and in Europe are quite frankly not very impressive. There's 1 in Berlin, 1 in Leipzig, 7 in Dublin, 3 in London, and 6 in Princeton. Yesterday there were still 5. Yesterday one of our colleagues discovered another Princeton manuscript, so today there are 6. That's what I had to change in the afternoon. One of the nice moments of changing the PowerPoint. This is really not a massive manuscript drain to Europe and the US. You know, this is not supported by these figures. This is rather a faint trickle of manuscripts towards Europe and the US. And the impression that moving manuscripts to Europe and the US was not a large-scale process is reinforced when considering that 13 out of these manuscripts were taken out of the library by one single trader who is this Abraham Yehuda. He's basically the one who sold 13 manuscripts, which ended up ultimately in Princeton and in Dublin. But these numbers can still be taken as indicative, as we have not succeeded in identifying a large number of al-Jazzar manuscripts so far. So shortly, the methodological challenges, which are well known to anybody working on libraries. The first one is that library catalogues obviously normally do not register provenance traces, which we would like to have. But more problematically, the library catalogues often don't mention, for example, the stamp in the catalog itself. So finding an al-Jazzar manuscript basically means going through manuscripts. There's no chance of looking through catalogs to find them. And the second challenge is that these provenance traces have often been removed over the last 200 years in this case, such as the endowment stamp, for example, so that it is often quite difficult to identify a given manuscript that was in the al-Jazzar library. This is often only possible by multispectral imaging, where you basically would see again the traces of what has been removed. And you can imagine, I mean, already looking through thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s of manuscripts is one task, but doing multispectral imaging on a larger corpus of manuscripts is entirely impossible. So in a sense, one could argue that these numbers are not terribly useful, as we just have these methodological challenges. However, and now I argue that they are meaningful, because for the collections in Europe and the US, by now we have a relatively good research basis. And this is to a large extent because of the work of the Bibliotheca Arabica project in Leipzig, where Boris Liebrenz is also active, who over the last 10 years has gone through 10,000s of manuscripts and has registered the provenance traces. So he has registered the stamps and the owners. And so for the US and European collections on which Boris Liebrenz focused, we have in fact a very good research database. So these numbers are relatively realistic. I mean, for sure, there's still dozens out there which we haven't found, but they are in a relatively realistic realm of numbers. If we now look beyond Europe and the US, we see indeed that other destinations of translocated al-Jazzar manuscripts are evident. And this is firstly the wider West Asian regions, North Africa, Istanbul, Cairo, Mecca, Riyadh, and Qatar. With a total of 16 manuscripts, also again not very impressive. The really striking number is Istanbul, only 3. That Istanbul only attracted 3 manuscripts is quite surprising. And with Istanbul, we are very certain that there are not more, unless those where the provenance traces have been removed. But we have searched Istanbul very systematically and very intensively. And we don't know exactly when the library was taken apart, but that happened in the course of the 19th century in a slow process. That's very clear, but we don't really know the timeline yet. So what this number shows is that in the course of the 19th century, Istanbul stopped to attract large number of books. In the 18th century, whenever a library was dismantled in Bilad al-Sham, you had a massive translocation of manuscripts to Istanbul. Jarullah Effendi Library, you know, which Berat Açıl studied. If you look at it, the number of manuscripts from Bilad al-Sham and Cairo is very impressive. And this is exactly how they moved to Istanbul. It didn't happen anymore seemingly in the 19th century. The really striking point, if we look at where the al-Jazzar manuscripts are today, is a different one. And this is the number of manuscripts which are still in Bilad al-Sham. There are still 40 manuscripts in Acre itself, in the library. 11 are in Jerusalem, 4 in Damascus, 2 in Nablus, 1 in Jaffa, 2 in Beirut. Overall, 34 manuscripts are still within the southern Bilad al-Sham region. As said, I mean, we can't really argue with absolute numbers, but we can argue with relative numbers. And I'm fairly confident that in relative terms, these numbers roughly play out. So the first result is that the manuscripts of a library that was dismantled in the 19th century were more likely to stay in Bilad and Asham than they were to move to Europe and the US or to Istanbul. And that's a very different picture from the 18th century. As said, they would move to Istanbul. And in the 20th century, you would have a larger drain to Europe and the US. But in the 19th century, seemingly, it did not necessarily happen. The second point is that there is not really a central actor whom we are able to identify who was responsible for selling off manuscripts. We have Abraham Yehuda for Princeton and Dublin, and that's the only kind of centralish figure whom we got so far. Otherwise, it seems this was a very diffuse process, how these manuscripts ended up in different collections. And we can take one example for that, and that's the example of Jerusalem. So if we look at Jerusalem now, and look at where are the al-Jazzar library today? So there's one in the Isaf Nashashibi library, which is to the north of the old town of the city in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. 4 are in the Khalidiyya library, which is just next to the Haram al-Sharif. And 5 are in the National Library of Israel. Now, this is a very complicated story, which we briefly need to talk about. Because obviously the National Library of Israel was only founded in 1948. And the 5 manuscripts are in the abandoned property section of the National Library of Israel. Abandoned property are basically objects that were taken out of Palestinian homes during the 1948 foundation of the State of Israel. They were labeled with the legal concept of abandoned property. And they ended up in a whole range of different institutions, and also the National Library of Israel has the abandoned property section of books. And that's where all these 5 al-Jazzar manuscripts are, which means that these 5 manuscripts come out of Palestinian family libraries. So quite similar to Isaf al-Nashashibi and Khalidiyya. These were not dismantled in 1948 because they were in East Jerusalem. Abandoned property is only from West Jerusalem or all the sections which are today Israel. And just to take one example, this is one of the manuscripts. As you can see, this once was the stamp of al-Jazzar. It was defaced, but if you hold it against light, you are able to read it. And the ownership note, which we find next to it, is by a scholar called al-Dijani, who had a very substantial manuscript collection, and he notes in 1873 that this manuscript went into his possession. So at this point already, he got hold of a al-Jazzar manuscripts more than 70 years before the National Library of Israel was founded. So another example for this very diffusion of manuscripts within southern Bilad, Asham. Among the Jerusalem manuscripts, we have very diverse trajectories with numerous actors involved in trading and owning al-Jazzar manuscripts. And this is obviously not only true for Jerusalem, but also for the manuscripts which we find in Damascus or in Naples or in Beirut. Really, all of them have very individual stories. There's not the one big narrative of plunder which we are able to develop right now, but they are very individualized stories of how they happen to be in new ownership. A last example to show the diversities of actors, and then I'm coming to the end of my lecture. Another example to show the diversity of actors who were involved in owning and probably also dismantling the library of al-Jazzar is one of the manuscripts which are today in Qatar. You can imagine this is a rather recent acquisition. I mean, this is not a library with a very long-standing history. Here again, you have the al-Jazzar stamp, and here again, you have the endowment note by al-Jazzar, so the normal features. When we leaf through this manuscript, we see numerous marginalia that show that the manuscript must have been in the possession of a person writing Western Armenian on these pages, most likely somebody using Armenian in northern Bilad Sham or perhaps even in Anatolia. And as we see, this owner interacted with the manuscript in a very emotional way, as you can see from this note where he really has to say, read it. This is absolutely crucial. This has to be included. Okay, so what do we get out of these first insights into book cultures in an Arabic province of the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th, early 19th century? Quite clearly, bibliophilia as a concept is also helpful to understand the doings of a governor or political entrepreneur such as al-Jazzar. As much as the social changes of the 17th century, which Yavuz traced in his PhD thesis, led to the new phenomenon of independent library building, we see that the foundation and architecture of the library in Acre was deeply intertwined with the new constellation of political power that was emerging during this period. And obviously, al-Jazzar did not build an independent library building. This did not happen in the Arabic provinces. We have the first standalone libraries in the 1870s, and this is a state-driven process. This is basically the Ottoman state founding new libraries when the Ottoman state starts to claim responsibility for the cultural heritage, such, for example, in Damascus, when an Ottoman state library is being founded. But even then, not new buildings were built, but older buildings were repurposed for that aim. But at least if you look at the endowment complex of al-Jazzar, it is clear that he really wanted to mark the library within the architecture, that this was for him an outstanding feature. And if you walk towards the mosque complex today, obviously you first see this dome, but this dome is still quite a striking feature and certainly was an important marker for al-Jazzar, what he was aiming at. Perhaps most importantly, what we get out of this study of the library in the province is that in Istanbul, the grandiose role of library is still very much evident today, because many of the library buildings are still there. I mean, if you walk through Istanbul, you still see the library buildings as they are there, and many of the manuscripts are still here. You know, so I mean, if you live in Istanbul, if you're interested in manuscripts, it's very difficult to miss that this city has an enormously rich history of libraries. Istanbul is the center of Arabic manuscript culture in the world. You know, Cairo does not get close to it. Damascus is very far away from Istanbul. Istanbul is the center of Arabic manuscript culture. If you go to Acre today, hardly anything. You know, 25 manuscripts in a mosque library, which are not catalogued, which are not being studied, which are not really part of the urban topography of the city today. In places such as Acre, bibliophilia was, for the political and social elites, not less important. It simply has a much lower visibility today. And in order to understand what bibliophilia meant in the 18th century Ottoman Empire, it will be necessary to bring into the discussion libraries in places such as Acre that developed in close interaction with Istanbul, but not only Istanbul, but also other places such as Cairo. And this more integrated view of libraries will be deeply indebted to the work of Yavuz and the tantalizing arguments he made in his PhD exactly on the interconnection between architecture, between book history, and between intellectual/social history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I have a lot of questions, but I will try to restrict myself to a few, if not one. Maybe I missed that part, or maybe I did not, but You said that there's a change of the ways that the books traveled from Bilad al-Sham to other parts of the world. And in the 18th century, we see that Istanbul is still one of the nodes in this network, but then it disappears in 19th century. How can you explain that? And I guess there are no majmuas in this list, right? In this catalog. Some. Okay. I'm curious about that. And if there are only few, I guess we can connect it to this ruler image, the fact that he needs more precious books rather than majmuas. Or do you have any other explanation? And can you also tell us the how you work as a team? I'm also curious about that. And this project and projects that we come across recently, like Treasures of Knowledge, show that it's kind of a detective work when you're dealing with book history, like catalogs and libraries like that, and the fact that we need teamwork. And you briefly mentioned how Borges Librens is working on parts of it, and you are confident that there are no books of al-Jazzar in Istanbul. So I'm curious about your working style as a team as well. So I will just stop here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, for Bilad al-Sham and the travel of books, I think that it's quite clear really from a Bilad al-Shami perspective. I don't know how clear it is from an Istanbul perspective, but for me as a historian of Bilad al-Sham, it's quite clear that in the 19th century, the centrifugal cultural power of Istanbul is strongly declining, that there is less economic imbalance between the region. I mean, if you see al-Jazzar and the wealth which he was building up there, he clearly could compete on the book market with those coming from the center. And you see also the emergence of the elite libraries. And in the 19th century, for example, the Khalidiyya is still massively expanding, and they were going to Istanbul to buy books. So suddenly it's becoming the other way, that basically Bilad al-Shami traders are going to Istanbul and buy books and bring them to Bilad al-Sham. So there are quite a number of books in Jerusalem which have an Istanbul provenance in the 17th, 18th century, and then start to be in the area. And to some extent, it's certainly also that in the 19th century, European traders started to appear on the book markets as competitors, and quite strong competitors in terms of economic purchasing power. And so I think that the number of books which were available was just increasingly limited in the course of the 19th century. As for the majmuas, I think that's indeed quite striking, that we have a rather small number of majmuas compared to many other libraries, and is probably expression of the fact that he was really going for the big things, and might be, I mean, we are still discussing it as a team, to what extent is his library really purposefully built? To what extent do we really see al-Jazzar, or to what extent do we see random confiscation processes? And the fact that there are so few majmuas, which one would expect in a lot of private household libraries, does indicate that there might have been a sorting process, that they confiscated perhaps 500 books from poor Yahya, and 300 books were discarded as being completely irrelevant for him, and that he picked the 200 which he really liked. And the final work on the team, this is for me also the first time that I'm working in such a large team. Obviously, the digitization of our scholarly practices has enormously helped over the last 3 years, i.e. that Zoom meetings have become normal, that, I mean, all the shared docs, etc. are now quite normal for us to work with. So in the practices, it's quite handy. But there is certainly an unevenness, to what extent colleagues can engage with different parts of the project. And in January, we will have the first deadline for the draft versions of the chapters. Then we will have 3 days in March where we sit together and basically discuss the draft chapters, and this will obviously be the crucial point. Then we will go back and rewrite our chapters in October for it being the final submission. And I mean, it will not be a monograph. You know what I mean? There will be an imbalance in the depth of different chapters. It would be ridiculous to deny that. But let's say a historical phenomenon as complex to a library on which I've written monographs, by now I'm increasingly convinced that it's actually quite a good idea to bring together people who have expertise in different bits and pieces in which I have tripped in my previous books, but where I not really felt comfortable. So it's a trade-off, and in the moment I'm quite convinced that the drawbacks of having a large team are less than the drawbacks of writing my own monograph, but lacking expertise in many areas which are really crucial for that.
Thank you, and we can have questions from the audience. Chida.
Thank you. Duyuyor musunuz? Dr. Hirschler, for this, sharing this wonderful work with us. One thought and one question. I think the analogy you drew between Nur-u Osmaniye and this Nur Ahmediye makes perfect sense also in the case of the library, thinking that Nur-u Osmaniye was the first newly built Sultanic complex that had a library incorporated into it, that had a public library incorporated into it. Earlier than that, we have the Mehmed II complex, Mahmud building a library there, the Hagia Sophia, etc. But in the Nur-u Osmaniye, you have this, separate structure. So this affinity, makes, I think, perfect sense in your presentation too, of this, looking to Istanbul and perhaps looking to Nur-u Osmaniye. The question is, one of Yavuz's findings and one of his arguments was that the new scribal culture of 18th century Istanbul and the 18th century, both court and the city, was one of the motor forces behind this patronage of libraries, right? And, increase in copying books and also, publicization, opening up these collections beyond the court, also to the users of either these small complexes or the, individually built libraries. So I'm just wondering if, there's any parallel to this. Do you have any clues as to, what kind of a scribal establishment al-Jazzar worked with, whether there's a parallel to be drawn there, or alternately you would see this as just this, kind of a fiat project of this governor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, with the Nur-u Osmaniye, it's also quite interesting that the name today, the Nur-u Ahmadiye, is completely forgotten in Acre itself. So the Waqf never uses it. And because it's kind of an Ottoman building, whenever they have structural problems, they bring in Turkish building companies who always use Nur-u Ahmadiye. And the Waqf is always, why do they use Nur-u Ahmadiye? It's al-Jazzar mosque. So it's quite nice to see how this is still visible today, the different naming patterns. We don't have any, in terms of scribal practices, we don't have any manuscripts so far identified which were written for al-Jazzar. So we don't know, but it doesn't seem that there was a strong scribal culture centered around the court, but it was really a book-owning culture. But then once you got the books, obviously the question is, what did they mean? For the city, do they indicate a change in the city? Is there a transformation going on? And, we only have 80 manuscripts so far. So the number of manuscript notes which we can work is very limited. You know, I mean, that's where we would find the engagement. You know, people writing, you know, I'm here, I did something with the book, I read it, or if you find commentaries or hashir or something like that. So we don't have enough yet to really make a comment on that. And I think that this, let's say, if there was a transformation also in Bilad al-Sham in the 18th, early 19th century, which nobody has argued so far, and we don't have the empirical basis to argue it, but in order to do so, we would have to look at the sigilat. I think that would really give us an impression about book ownership in wider society. And for example, the Damascus sigilat are there throughout, Jerusalem is there throughout, Acre is a problem, but we have some other cities where we have at least some decades covered by the sigilat, and we would basically need 15, 18 PhD theses written on the different sigilat and trying to map book movements on the basis of that, and then we could see it. But on the basis of the al-Jazzar library, you're right, you know, we can't make this argument. For us, it seems very much like a closed shop code library so far.
Paolo?
Yes, thank you very much. I had a curiosity. Maybe everybody working on Acre knows it, but I don't. In a Mediterranean historical perspective, Acre stands out for the Crusader heritage. So I wonder, in the history books of this library, is there any trace of a perception, of a memory, of course, probably negative, of this Ahli Safil, or the Crusader?
Yeah. So no, clearly, I mean, if you look at the topography of Acre, you still see a lot of remnants of Crusader fortification, of the massive fort. I mean, it was the center of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after they lost Jerusalem. Then Acre became capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so it's difficult to miss. But after 1300, Acre really became a village. So the fortifications were destroyed. They're still there, but they were destroyed and they were not used. And there was a very strong process of de-urbanization because of economic changes towards Egypt. Plus, the Mamluk rulers did not want fortification on the Syrian coast, fearing a reconquest by European powers who would use the fortification. So they destroyed basically all fortification along the coast to a large extent. Al-Jazzar is remembered in, there's a very interesting body of popular remembrance, narratives about Al-Jazzar, which also a colleague is working on. So he hasn't submitted his chapter yet, so I can't really say what it is. But what it seems is that he is very much associated either with early Islamic heroic figures like the other heroes of popular romances like al-Batal, for example, or he's depicted as the anti-Napoleonic. So this is very strongly remembered, his defeat against Napoleon. But as far as I can see, the link to the Crusades, which would seem very obvious from our perspective, is not something which attracted a lot of interest during that period.
Professor Neumann, at the back, yes.
Thank you. A library, of course, needs readers. What do we know about the intellectual life, the courtly life, the patronage networks with intellectual poets, take whomever you will, scholars in Acre at Jazzar's times? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, as said, I mean, there's nothing about the madrasa activity, teacher, students, they are not there. But it's clear that al-Jazzar had also, let's say, a wider cultural program, interest, however you want to term it. But there were activities around the court in terms of attracting poets, for example, and he himself in some texts is also depicted as taking an interest. He was clearly fully fluent in Arabic, which is already quite important to underline, because I mean, Albanian, who was in an Ottoman context, he does not necessarily have to acquire Arabic to convert agriculture into cash crop agriculture, but he did. So yes, it seems, but it's not that, for example, in the book of Thomas Phillips, it's not a big story. So for him, it's not strongly visible in the sources which we have. And I mean, that's one of our aims, basically, to write in al-Jazzar as a cultural patron, hoping that the library is part of a bigger picture. What we have, but I mean, that's a very long shot. What is still in Acre today is the madrasa library of the 1870s, 80s, 90s. And to my knowledge, it's the only extant Ottoman madrasa library in Palestine. And that's an extremely rich library. And what you see there is very interesting, that you see people from all across the town and from villages in northern Palestine, modern day northern Palestine, southern Lebanon, endowing books into the library. And we start to wonder whether there was kind of a remembrance of this library being part of the urban topography, that after the manuscripts were dismantled, that people started to endow, that's printed books, the ones which are extant today, that's a collection of roughly 1,000 printed books. So they are endowed by the population really of the city and of the villages. And yeah, still a long shot, but our hope, or not our hope, our hypothesis is that this might be a remnant of a larger cultural function this library had.
There was a question at the back, yeah. Then Suyong and Ali.
Başka biri mi acaba? Thank you. I will ask in Turkish if it is possible.
Yeah, I give it a try. If I don't understand, you help me.
Evet, ben çok teşekkür ederim konuşmacımıza. Bize bilgiler verdiler, çok ilginç bilgiler. Bazı fikirleri söylerken işte bunu iyi bilemiyoruz, bu kesin bir şey söyleyemeyiz, şöyle yapamayız falan dediler. Fakat bu Yahya Efendi'nin kitaplarının zorla alındığını, kesin olarak zorla alındığını söylediler. Bunu nasıl anladılar yani? Bunu ben çözemedim. Çünkü yani Cezzar Ahmet Paşa bir Osmanlı paşası. Bir Müslümanlar da el koymak, kul hakkı vesaire çok önemlidir. Üstelik burada cami söz konusu, kitap söz konusu. Daha da nazik bir konu. Bunu açıklarlarsa teşekkür ederiz. Yani el koyma meselesi Batılılarda var, Türklerde pek yok.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's fine. Yeah, so I mean, in the end, we don't know whether they were confiscated. The term used in the inventory is ma'khūd, taken from, which is a very neutral term, but let's say al-Jazzar and his mint certainly had an interest in using neutral terms when they appropriated objects. It's quite clear that al-Jazzar appropriated large amount of objects in his realms. That's beyond doubt. I mean, in what is today southern Lebanon, Jabal Amel, the Shiite region of Lebanon, there was a strong decline in intellectual activity in the late 18th century during the period of al-Jazzar, and this is always linked to al-Jazzar, that he was basically going into the houses and putting his hand on books and appropriating these books. And this is certainly, let's say, part of confiscation, musadara, which was part of a political practice during that period. I mean, as much as Constantinople, Istanbul, appropriated, confiscated objects from people like al-Jazzar, and there was a massive drain of objects from al-Jazzar to Istanbul later on. In the Ottoman archives, that's Yasin Arslantash, he has found already, I think it's 400 documents on the confiscation of al-Jazzar by Istanbul. So that was a massive process which they engaged in. So for him, it was clearly normal to do so. So basically taking together the information which we have on Jabal Amel in Lebanon, decline, al-Jazzar taking books which are Arabic sources, plus knowing that confiscation was a normal part of political process, this term ma'khūd, taken from, I think can be interpreted as confiscation, but you're entirely right, we don't have the smoking gun. I mean, we don't have the conclusive proof to say it is confiscation. It will always remain open to debate.
Okay, same row, there are two questions, then we can get... Okay.
I just want to follow up on your comment to Chidam's question about this methodological issue. I mean, the obvious step for me, from what you described, is this is a local book cultural scene, right? Because the assumption is that a lot of the books were confiscated, going back to whether it was confiscated or not. But there's no sigils. You can't look at probate records to get a sense of what was being collected at the same period. But has anyone, like a student or someone part of the working group, has started looking at contemporary sigils from other sort of Shami cities as a way to just start thinking about not so much Istanbul-centric, but as a very localized culture? Because as you pointed out, at a certain earlier period, all these books ended up in Istanbul, but obviously there were enough copies made of certain titles or what have you. So this is clearly a local scene. That's the impression I get from what you described. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think you're right. It's probably mostly a local scene plus highlights. So the Fihrist of al-Nadim, I think that's a trans-local book which he got his hand on. The endowment deed by Beybas, most likely he got that from Cairo. There's a very high chance. Yeah, and your proposed methodology, I think, is exactly right. I mean, that's what we would need to do in order to get a sense, you know, of what was the book culture during that period. But it's not possible within the al-Jazzar project. It would really require PhD theses, and if anybody is interested. I mean, there are massive, really fascinating PhD theses which can be written on the sigillat, and if I would not be tied down with other things in my life, I would certainly go for that and spend 3 or 4 years reading these sigillat, and there are book owners we would have never dreamed of, you know, well beyond the elites. You have a quite strong female book ownership, which is hardly visible from the chronicles, so the stories you could tell from that is really enormous. But for the time being, we are basically operating in a, with a lack of comparators, basically. That's our problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your lecture. I have two basic questions. One is a continuation of the previous one, perhaps, and whether the view shouldn't just look towards Istanbul, but also, as you mentioned, to Cairo and the precedents in Cairo. I mean, the figure himself has deep connections to the place, and whether there aren't, and of course the practices that he instituted in Acre were also modeled on some precedents in Egypt, Ali Bey al-Kabir, and the cultural developments that came along with those transformations in the later 18th century in Cairo and around northern Egypt. So I was wondering whether there's evidence of that connection other than the Mamluk connection, which is an interesting one, or the Fihrist and the Khat al-Masri, but if there's more to that kind of regional dynamic. And then the other question is also a geographical one. Since you're claiming a representativeness to the provenance of the various destinations of the books, are there thematic clusters? So this type of book would go in that direction more than in another, or something of the sort. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks. The first one with Cairo, to be honest, I mean, we missed that for quite long as a project. So we had always looked towards Istanbul, and for us, he was Ottoman. You know, so for us, the point of reference was always Ottoman. And Cairo was Ottoman too, sorry. Yeah, okay. But let's say Cairo really has a specific neo-Mamluk Ottoman culture. You know, I mean, there's no doubt that, I mean, I want to say that it's not, but I mean, the political culture is specific in Cairo. So we saw him as part of, let's say, Istanbul-shaped political culture, and Bilad Sham did not really develop, you know, anything specific which we could call Biladi political culture, whereas Egypt clearly did. And so we start to trace that, but we have not really conceptualized that in any wider, meaningful way. But it's clear that this was deeply entrenched. So one of the men of al-Jazzar, one of the Mamluks, he calls himself also Mamluk throughout his period. He becomes the strong man after al-Jazzar's death, and not as strong, but still quite influential. And what does he do? He builds a massive library, which is another case which needs to be studied, but we won't do it. We've taken the decision, no. And there, again, his men, which are also named, they are again named Mamluk. So it seems that for themselves, they saw themselves clearly as part of the Mamluk elite of Cairo, and that was their point of reference. But yeah, there needs to be more done on our side to write the Egyptian angle into the story.
Other questions? Over there? You. Then you. Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I want to ask something about these abandoned books in the Israeli National Library. Is there a specific collection named as abandoned books? Or do we know this as a source of acquisition? Is it indicated in that way? Or are there other books as abandoned books from other libraries in this National Library?
Yeah. Okay. That's going to be a long story. I try to cut it short. So you have the print section, manuscript section. Within the print section, you have abandoned property labeled. It's AP1, AP2, AP3. And if you Google abandoned property, the Grand Book Theft, it's called. It's a documentary by al-Jazzar. It's 1 hour. So that tells the story of the print part of the library quite nicely. The manuscript part has been missed so far. That has not been picked up. And there are 3 main sections in the Arabic script manuscript section of the National Library of Israel. The one is Yehuda. Again, Abraham Yehuda. He died in New York in 1851. Big family clash, complicated story. They move over to Israel, the manuscript which he had in his private ownership. That's a big collection, Yehuda. And then you have the general NLI class mark, which has a whole variety of different backgrounds, acquisitions, you know, as libraries grow these days. And the third part is the AP section, and that's again labeled. So it's AP, AR1, AP, AR2, etc. And it's not a secret. The librarian of the Islamic manuscripts in Jerusalem, when they started to appoint somebody, that's I think in the 1960s, he had a whole list. He had worked on them, and he had started to trace the previous owner. So it was not something hidden, so to say, but it has never been published. And now there's a student who's working on that, and who will hopefully, basically, I forgot to say, the Dijani story, which I told, goes very much back to that student, Vincent Engelhardt, who's working on that, and he traced that family down. So there will be more movement into that. But as you can imagine, AP is a very sensitive topic, because, I mean, also land, houses, anything is AP. You know, so if you start to talk about AP, you talk about very much the heart, you know, of 1948. So I would say it's avoided, but it's not banned. You know, I think that's how it is.
Last few questions, maybe, if you're tired. Gentlemen, here. Here, yeah. You had a question?
You said that Jazzar was or not so much interested in reading his books, the books in his library, if I'm not mistaken. Why do you suppose so? Is there any kind of record? Is it because of his personality?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the manuscripts which we have, we find no traces of al-Jazzar engaging with the manuscripts, but, I mean, that's not a very strong proof of absence, you know, because, I mean, how many rulers read a book and leave a trace on it? So, but that's one part, you know, at least there's no positive evidence which we have of al-Jazzar reading, and it's very much let's say, comment based on the personality as it is depicted in these later sources. And some of them are not that negative. For example, these popular romances, you know, where he's depicted as a hero. And it's very much a warlike figure as he is remembered. And he must have been quite remarkable. I mean, he was fighting until basically shortly before his death. He was until his 70s. He was on the horseback and was leading assaults against his enemies. So that's what he's remembered for. And so again, sure, I mean, no conclusive proof. Perhaps we are wrong. Perhaps we will find the smoking gun at some point that al-Jazzar actually engaged with the books. But so far, all evidence which we have is rather pushing us towards assuming that he was not deeply interested in the books. But if you would ever write that, it would be probably an introduction. It would be a paragraph with a very strong caveat, you know, with a very strong health warning. Perhaps we are influenced by these chronicles, which always depict him as brutal, despotic, tyrant, etc.
Maybe the last question, if there are no burning questions over there, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I learned a lot. My question might be tangential to the other questions, previous questions. So I was wondering if the al-Jazzar collection reflects, can we say that like al-Jazzar was interested in the contemporary military reforms or the economic things, and does his collection reflect any interest in the like contemporary technical, I don't know, progresses happening in the region or in Europe? I was just wondering about that, like given the Napoleonic Wars or that context. Thank you.
Good question. I think I'm not really in a position to answer that really convincingly. I mean, there start to be printed books in his library, which is already interesting because I mean that's a very early, you know, beginning of printing. So he clearly had an interest what was coming from Istanbul. These are books from Istanbul, which he had in his library. There is the section on Hendese, engineering, etc., but they are all coming out of an Ottoman Islamic tradition. There's nothing which I've seen so far which would indicate any strong lines of connection to Europe. And the books which are coming out of Ottoman Islamic tradition are not books yet which I think could be counted as part of European influence being there and then being indirectly transmitted to Acre. I think he was quite happy in his world. I mean, he defeated Napoleon, which was quite good. He converted, I mean, the agriculture into a brutal cash crop agriculture, which we don't know who his advisors were, how he did it. Certainly there were a lot of French traders around who might have given him ideas, etc. But it's not that there's this, that he had identifiable men at his court, for example, you know, whom we could identify as these westernizer reformers.
Maybe one very last question, then we call it tonight.
Thank you very much for fitting me in. I was just wondering, on the point when you showed the map of al-Jazzar's realm, clearly there's an awful lot of diversity there. So if you're just straight up confiscating, kind of slightly at random from different communities, surely you would expect to find a lot of Druze religious literature, Shia religious literature in your records there. Is that showing up? Or is there an editorial process going on? We're taking the good stuff from the Druze and Shia and we're getting rid of the religious stuff which isn't valuable for us as Sunnis?
Yeah. So that must have happened because, I mean, there's clearly, I mean, there were a lot of Christian book owners who most likely were confiscated, and as you said, Druze, Shiites, so quite a colorful bunch of people. There's definitely nothing Druze. There's nothing Christian in the library. There are books which we might consider to be Shiite, but then there are colleagues who have identified moments of confessional ambiguity. So I would be rather hesitant, to label them, Chak Shiite, Chak Sunni. That would certainly require more research, but at least these are books which might potentially come out of Shiite contexts. And there must have been a selection process going on that they said, no, it's definitely not anything we are interested in.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Professor Hirschler, for this amazing talk.